Welcome to the final program of our series, Alexander Hamilton, the Man Who Made Modern America. Since it is the final program, I do want to, at this time, acknowledge all of our sponsors, most of them public entities. The exhibit was brought here through the auspices of a number of prestigious organizations, the American Library Association, the New York Historical Society, that's the New York City Historical Society, the Gilder Lehrman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities all contributed in making the exhibit possible. The programming, however, we are responsible for doing it locally, and thanks mostly to the generosity of the taxpayers of Missoula, the Missoula Public Library, as you know, has a decent budget for the first time in a long time. We're in excellent shape, and we were able to have funds sufficient in the adult program to bring a pretty decent set of programs this time. So it was from the public library budget, and also the Missoula Public Library Foundation and the Friends of the Missoula Public Library all contributed to this. And as I told you, or some of you last week when Don Hickey was here, that particular program was funded by a grant from Humanities Montana, formerly known as the Montana Committee for the Humanities. So those are our sponsors. And now, our speaker this evening, Billy Smith is a professor of history at Montana State University. You didn't tell me here how long you've been there.
About a quarter century.
Quarter century.
Too long.
And he is the author of 8 books. And if you brought some of those, we could have had those for sale.
There'd be more like giveaways, actually.
And he's currently working on another book that will be published by the National Geographic Society, am I correct? Called Death Ship, The Voyage That Changed the Atlantic World. In recognition of his scholarship, last year he was elected a member of the American Antiquarian Society of Massachusetts. During his career, his research has focused primarily on laboring men, women, and slaves in early America, precisely the kind of people that Alexander Hamilton dismissed as unimportant. Which is his writing, not mine. The only further thing I'll say, and I just think it was kind of interesting, and I had never met Billy Smith, but I figured, we've been corresponding via email, but I figured anybody who signs off on his email with this quotation, "Happy trails and be good to your horse," can't be all bad. Billy Smith.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Don, and to the library. And I know, having organized some programs like this, although not this extensive in Bozeman, how difficult it is. And thanks very much to Don for doing all of this. Thanks for some of the friends who've shown up tonight as well as other people I don't know, but hopefully we'll have a chance to maybe chat a little bit afterwards as well and have some questions too. Also, thanks very much for showing up on Valentine's Day, Valentine's night. And actually, in honor of that, and partly to make up for the fact that I am just going to bash the hell out of Hamilton tonight, I decided that, because I am supposed to be presenting an alternative interpretation, but I decided in honor of Valentine's Day we should at least start out with something slightly different. And so I've invited my own partner and wife and Professor Michelle Maskeel from that other university, Montana State University, to also join me up here, actually to recognize and to read a little bit from John and Abigail Adams' letters in honor of Valentine's Day. In any case, as you probably know, John and Abigail had a love affair really for 50 years, had 5 children in any case, had multiple homes across several different continents and 3 different countries, endured lengthy separations, not to mention a revolution, wars, an array of political and diplomatic crises. We know of their romance primarily through their letters, which number around 1,100 letters as they wrote during their lives. And we're just going to touch on those a little bit, again, to honor Valentine's Day in any case. So first, and in case you haven't guessed, I'm going to play the part of John Adams because I look just like him, about his height and just as rotund. My charming partner here, Professor Maskeel, will be Abigail. After meeting Abigail Smith in the summer 1759, I wrote, I was unimpressed. She was not fond, nor frank, nor very candid. However, within 3 years, I wrote her this letter, Ms. Adorable. By the same token that I sat up with you last night, I hereby order you to give me as many kisses and as many hours of your company after 9 o'clock as I shall please to demand, and just charge them to my account.
1774. My much-loved friend, I dare not express to you at 300 miles distance how ardently I long for your return. I have some very miserly wishes and cannot consent to your spending 1 hour in town till at least I have had you for 12 hours. The idea plays about my heart, unnerves my hand whilst I write, awakens all the tender sentiments that years have increased and matured. May the like sensations enter thy breast.
Is there no way two friendly souls to converse together, although the bodies are 300 miles off? Yes, by letter. But I want a better communication. I want to hear you think or see your thoughts. The conclusion of your letter makes my heart throb. You bid me burn your letters, but I must forget you first.
1776. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And, by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
You are so saucy. As to the extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and that Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented.
After John was elected president in 1796, my dearest friend, should I draw you the picture of my heart, it would be what I hope you would still love, though it contained nothing new. The early possession you obtained there and the absolute power you have obtained over it leaves not the smallest space unoccupied. I look back to the early days of our acquaintance and friendship as to the days of love and innocence with an indescribable pleasure. I have seen near a score of years roll over our heads with an affection heightened and improved by time. Nor have the dreary years of absence in the smallest degree effaced from my mind the image of the dear man to whom I gave my heart. And after John lost the presidential election of 1800, I'm very glad you consented to come home. It is fit and proper that you and I should retire together and not one before the other.
These exchanges, of course, give us some flavor, anyway, of their relationship. And it is the kind of relationships that is beginning to emerge in America, at least among middle-class white people in the late 18th century, of relationships built much more on fondness and love for one another than it is a mere economic partnership that might have characterized a lot of relationships previously. As a transition from this, though, and from Valentine's Day celebration to considering Alexander Hamilton, let's at least listen to what Abigail had to say about Hamilton.
Hamilton is a second Napoleon Bonaparte. I read his heart in his wicked eyes, and the very devil is there.
And indeed, many of the people at the time also concurred with this kind of assessment of Hamilton. We have all kind of descriptions of him being, and as I'm sure you've heard before if you've been to the other presentations, extremely vain, particularly arrogant, overly ambitious, in which he treated people as objects to achieve the goals he wanted to, aggressive, domineering, trying to dominate basically everybody around him. Seems to be a consensus about Hamilton as well. And brilliant, almost everybody describes him as. Of course, we all know that brilliance can only carry you so far. For example, the Enron people, who were characterized as the smartest people in the room always, we know where it took them. The best and brightest of Kennedy's administration that got us into Vietnam, we also know what that brilliancy took to them. But other people concurred about Hamilton, and you may have heard this in the Four Presidents description of him as well. John Adams on Hamilton says, a restless, impatient, artful, unprincipled intriguer, a great hypocrite, he calls him as well, as debauched in morals as Benjamin Franklin, which was one of my favorites since John Adams came to despise Benjamin Franklin when he served with him in Paris and thought that Franklin was incredibly debauched. A man devoid of every moral principle, a Creole bastard, John Adams also says about him, which is particularly startling since it touches on the fact that indeed Alexander Hamilton, as you probably know, was born out of wedlock to his parents in any case, and born in the Caribbean. So clearly Adams is trying to cut close to the bone here. Other things that are said about him, especially by people like Jefferson and Madison, and again, I'm sure you heard more last time, but most simply, and if I can do my PowerPoint, they just call him essentially a coward. Which has some irony, especially coming from Jefferson, somebody who was accused a bit of cowardice during the Revolutionary War when he was governor of Virginia. And as soon as the British set foot on Virginia soil, even though he was several hundred miles away, he fled Virginia. And so it is a little bit ironic here for Jefferson to be making this comment on Hamilton, although Madison perhaps is a little bit more geared in that fashion. Of course, Hamilton gave as good as he got. This was not a guy who was shy about conflict with other people. What Hamilton said about Jefferson is he's not scrupulous about the means of success, not very mindful of truth, a contemptible hypocrite as well. What Hamilton said about John Adams, has great and intrinsic defects in his character. He suffers from extreme egotism. He has an ungovernable temper as well. Of course, Adams's sharp tongue and pen got him into problems, and in fact it was his insults of Aaron Burr that finally precipitated that famous duel that eventually cost Hamilton his life. So Hamilton wasn't shy of coming into conflict with other people. But to return to his personality and his characteristics, I mean, he really is a person, especially from our 21st century perspective in America, a person that most of us would not want to sit down and have a beer with, quite frankly. I mean, this is somebody who knew he was superior to virtually everybody else in the room. He paid a bit of deference to George Washington, but not too many other people. He was certain of his brilliance and certain of his superiority. And again, he would not fit in our early 21st century society because of that. He was also a person to think about character a little bit, and especially, you know, vis-a-vis Bill Clinton and others who have, or the train of others, especially in the last few years, who have brought some shame on themselves in a variety of ways, but in his adulterous relationships. It could be, although we don't know for certain, that he had an affair with his wife's sister. Usually not a very honorable thing for most people to do. We don't know for certain once again, but it's surely the evidence mostly points that way. What we do know for certain is he also had an affair with one Maria Reynolds in the 1790s, and it became extremely messy. She was not a particularly honorable character herself, nor was her husband. But the way in which Hamilton also became entangled in all of this were accusations against him that he had actually become financially corrupt. and perhaps helped out the husband because he was blackmailed. Hamilton, in turn, responded to all of these accusations, and the way that he got around them was to say, instead of being financially corrupt, no, he was just having an affair, basically. And he published some of the letters that she had sent to him. I mean, this is a pretty despicable character in writing in the newspaper. The charge against me is a connection with one James Reynolds for improper pecuniary speculation, but my real crime is an amorous connection with his wife. So he dismissed it in that fashion. So why do we honor this apparent cad of Alexander Hamilton? Again, you've had lots of sessions here in terms of thinking about that. And I think two of the most important reasons that people usually put forward is because of his financial brilliance and the way in which he set America on a financial road to stability in the 1790s. Clearly the second being he's advocating a stronger federal government, something that Hamilton was always for, and clearly in these two ways something that he won too. Even though Adams opposes him eventually, even though Jefferson opposes him, even though Jefferson wins the election in 1800 while Hamilton fades and gets killed, it's still Hamilton's system that continues to exist. Jefferson does not dismantle that, and it's that system that continues to exist in America throughout much of the 19th century. However, there are other reasons, contemporary reasons, I think, that are connected to the exhibit that was here too. Why we honor Hamilton, or why at least some people among us honor Hamilton, I should say, since I'm not really honoring him much tonight. And that is two important books that came out within the last 6 or 7 years. There was Richard Brookhiser's book, which came out, I think, about 2000 or 1999. And indeed, Brookhiser was the one who then organized the exhibit on Hamilton in New York City, and that's part of the exhibit that also has traveled here and around America since. Ron Chernow is another one who wrote a book 3 or 4 years ago about Hamilton. Both authors, quite frankly, although good historians, are very conservative or neoconservatives. Both people find Hamilton to be their hero because I think in many ways what they believe is that Hamilton represents something about America that they truly like. As they call him, and call him in this exhibit, or I should say more specifically, Brookhiser, he's the man who made modern America. That is America as it is today, a blend of high finance, central banking, federal government, which is extremely strong, industrialization, and global power. We should, according to these authors and to this exhibit, look to Hamilton for helping to make all of this possible. However, I, of course, am tasked with something different, and that is offering an alternative view, a more critical perspective of Hamilton. And quite frankly, it's something that personally I relish, because I find him to be the famous founding father that I despise the most in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. Because I think this is not the hero that we should pick for our own times. And I think there's lots of reasons why he should not become the hero representative of our times and the person we look to. Let me tick off some of those ways. And again, I'm sure a lot of these issues have been discussed in previous sessions. But a couple of the things that I would point to is that Hamilton starts off clearly starts off before that with, rising from rags to riches in many ways, attracting the attention of George Washington, becoming his personal secretary, being incredibly good at it, and being flattering to Washington as well, who responds well to Hamilton. But in 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, as many of you may know, a number of soldiers get together, especially officers in Newburgh and New York, and there's talk of conspiracy there that's created by the soldiers, again, not soldiers, I'm sorry, by the officers, but certainly fully supported by Hamilton in many ways, behind the scenes, working with Robert Morris, one of the person who's the financier of the American Revolution, working together to encourage the soldiers to say they won't lay down their arms and they may even march on Philadelphia or New York and take over the country and stage a coup until they are paid. Hamilton's interest is less in the soldiers themselves and the officers being paid than it is in the investors. He wants a strong national government that can levy a federal tax that will pay off the investors who have invested a lot of money in the American Revolution. Yeah, if the officers get paid, he'll be happy with that as well. But his major interest is in the investor class and in tying them to America in 1783. So he tries to convince Washington to join in this conspiracy because he knows if Washington joins in, then the conspiracy is going to go forward. And quite frankly, it would probably be pretty obvious Washington would become a kind of quasi-dictator of America. Washington, much to his credit at this time, declines to do that. Hamilton, indeed, instead goes in front of the officers, gives a very dramatic speech in which he convinces them not to go forward with that conspiracy. Once he does that, Hamilton, being the very astute and changeable political animal he is, very quickly changes his tune and begins to rat out some of his fellow compatriots. Again, not a particularly honorable guy in this fashion, not one it seems to me that we should look for as a hero in our own era. Other reasons to be suspect of Hamilton, seems to me, he's an avowed elitist, somebody who is unabashedly an elitist, somebody who would not fit well, again, in our 21st century or even in the late 18th century among many Americans at that time. As you may know that at the Constitutional Convention, he gets up and gives a 6-hour speech, something I'm not going to inflict upon you, in which he says we should return to a monarchy. He's talking to people who have just spent 7 years fighting a war against what they think is an authoritarian government in Britain. And he's saying, let's go back to that system. Let's have a monarchy. Toward the end of that speech, he says, I realize actually this isn't going to fly. And indeed, people are almost chuckling at him because they are not going to agree, even the 55 men at the convention who themselves are pretty elitist. But they know this has gone too far. So he says, all right, if we're not going to go to a monarchy, well, let's at least have a president and a Senate elected for life. And his expectations are that there will be indeed a ruling class in which the president and the Senate will not be responsible for the people or to the people in any kind of electoral sense. Indeed, he says as well about the Congress, the House, he says, well, I just expect that the Congress will be composed of rich landholders, merchants, men of the learned professions. These are the kind of people who he identifies with. This is the class of people who he identifies with and who he is advocating for at that convention. Other reasons to be suspect of Hamilton, and quite frankly not to admire him very much, is because his entire financial program throughout most of his life, once he gets into a position of power into the 1780s and 1790s, is designed to benefit the wealthy. He is really interested in tying the merchants and the industrialists, or the emerging industrialists at this point, into the U.S. government. Now, that's often been excused by saying, well, he's just looking for stability. In reality, though, when you look at almost everything he does, it is much more than just stability. It is favoring a class that he identifies with very much. One of the ways we can see that is a whiskey tax that happens in 1793 that Hamilton is the author of, pretty much convinces the Congress to pass because it's got to pay for his funding bill that he's also got the Congress to pass. And that whiskey tax is much heavier on small producers of whiskey. Farmers in the backcountry of Pennsylvania, for example, are particularly hard hit with this. It's not that the whiskey is that important to them in many ways. They're still making most of their money through farming. But on the other hand, if you're going to raise corn in the backcountry of Pennsylvania with not very good roads to get that corn to market, what you have to do to make it worthwhile is to turn it into something more valuable, whiskey. And so as you see here, at least a sort of old-time image of somebody taking whiskey to the marketplace. What Hamilton does through the whiskey tax, which again he basically writes and gets passed, is to tax small-time producers very heavily, to however tax large distillers at a much lower rate. His notion is, let's consolidate. Let's get the small farmers to give up this kind of production so they won't be in the marketplace and competing against the large distillers. Even more so than that, and what I find most appalling, is that he says, well, I think the large distillers should be the ones who collect the taxes out there in Western Pennsylvania. Can you imagine if you're a business person today, or even in the 18th century, if your competitors are collecting the taxes? This isn't going to work very well for you. Hamilton knows this as well. And this is a shrewd calculation on his part. And he realizes how much power this is going to invest in the hands of the wealthier classes, especially the large distillers in this case. Hamilton also, and I find this particularly apropos for our own times, advocates military action on a variety of occasions, in part to strengthen the national government, in part to further his own ends and his own ambitions as well, but in part as a way to strengthen the national government. In the Whiskey Rebellion of 1793, he assembles an army, has George Washington lead the army with him, and Washington realizes after going out to Western Pennsylvania, getting a few miles down the road, this probably isn't the appropriate thing for the president to be doing, to try and put down these whiskey rebels in the back country. So Hamilton gladly takes over and marches the army out to Western Pennsylvania to put down what is really a small-time rebellion, but that he magnifies in many ways by using the military in this fashion. Same thing happens, as I'm sure people have talked about and here in other sessions too, at the end of the 1790s, when he is the staunchest advocate for a number of years of waging war on France. Now, Hamilton hates France because of the Revolution, because of what it represents. He loves England because of what it represents as a monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. But he uses the occasion to once again raise an army supported by the federal government and to become at least nominal head of that for a very brief time until Adams finally steps forward in a very courageous fashion and makes the decision that indeed the United States is not going to have an all-out war with France. And really, in many ways, Adams' finest moment, because he sacrifices his own political career on that, does not get reelected in 1800, even though that probably would have been the most popular thing to do at that point. So Hamilton, though, has very few qualms about advocating strong military action as a way to strengthen the national government. Hamilton also, and I think this too is appropriate for our own times, really has a disdain for individual civil rights. In the Whiskey Rebellion, when he leads the troops out there, they kick down doors, arrest hundreds and hundreds of people, hardly any of whom are subsequently convicted by any jury. He doesn't really have a legal right to do this, but it's something he pursues because he thinks it's good for the country, essentially. And individual civil rights be damned from his perspective. He also supports the alien and sedition rights, of course, in 1798, 99, 1800, and is particularly vociferous in trying to hang Albert Gallatin, the person who's going to become the Secretary of the Treasury under Jefferson, very prominent man who's, Lewis and Clark name a river in our valley after, in any case, because he thinks he is traitorous. And Hamilton really has few qualms about advocating this kind of behavior on the part of the federal government. Finally, let me talk about a few things about Hamilton to admire, since I have gone through the litany of things that I find disgusting about him in one way or another. His anti-slavery, as opposed to lots of the famous founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton is almost always against slavery. That's usually attributed to the fact that he grew up, or at least was born in the Caribbean, where he saw what conditions of slavery did to Africans and African Americans. However, Hamilton was part of that group of the Founding Fathers, of course, at the convention, in which they really compromised on slavery, perhaps much more than they needed to do. And he is one of those people who was willing to compromise his anti-slavery feelings in order to get the Union itself. Another thing that we might admire Hamilton about is his rags to riches success, very much like Benjamin Franklin in this sense. I mean, this is a person who clearly is incredibly brilliant, ambitious, works his way to the top through a variety of ways. But again, at the same time, a sort of reservation about that, and that is, he doesn't turn around and reach his hand out to other people, whereas Franklin does in many cases. But Hamilton is never that concerned about poor people, it seems like, at least in most of his dealings once he gets into power. A third thing that clearly I think we celebrate today in many ways is that he is this advocate for a stronger national government, which clearly comes about both because of his efforts and a variety of other things. He does indeed fully endorse, support this, and it is implemented, as I mentioned earlier, and does become really a policy that's followed for decades after this. So at least three things we can think about in regards to Hamilton that I think are positive as opposed to all these others I've listed. However, I would also suggest in closing here that there are a lot of other people we might admire during this era who are much more worthy of our respect and much more attuned to who we are as a nation today. Benjamin Franklin, of course, the sort of the great representative of common people and all of his fabulous accomplishments for the community. Abigail Adams, I don't even need to talk about her since we've already been reminded about the Remember the Ladies quote, which has become so famous. Slave rebels, people who resisted slavery and also during the American Revolutionary era really did fight for their freedom and liberty more than almost anybody else in America. Seems to me are people we can hold up as people we would really like to think about when we're thinking about heroes and heroines. Joseph Brant, an Iroquois leader who struggled to protect his people's lands and cultures during the American Revolution, even though he ends up fighting against the revolutionaries, is still somebody who, it seems to me, we can find values that are very much in tune with 21st century Americans. Also somebody like Tom Paine, clearly the spokesperson for democracy and for individual rights and for poorer people. To not end this entire series on too sad of a note and to come back to the conclusion where we started with Valentine's Day. This is an 18th century engraving by the Quakers in which there's a joke inside of it. It's about marriage and courtship. You can see that these two people in courtship are smiling at one another. But if you turn this piece of paper upside down, when you get to the marriage part, they don't look nearly as happy, is the sort of joke within here. But not to leave us on a sad note, but instead a happy one, we'll just turn it back over again. Once again, happy Valentine's Day. And for what it's worth, happy Alexander Hamilton too. There's lots of people here who know more about Alexander Hamilton than I do, and I would invite them to join the conversation at our questions, comments, thoughts, jokes, juicy personal stories that anybody would like to share for us at this point. Yes, ma'am.
I was really interested by some of the points that you made that I was completely ignorant of them. And the first one that seems the most striking to me is that he came out of the Continental Congress and advocated for a return to monarchy.
I know. It's amazing.
How come we never hear about it? That's astonishing.
Well, Adams has a streak of that as well. There's a number of people, I know, and I found this quite incredible as I bumped into it, not just recently, but a while ago, is how can you fight a war, a really bloody, nasty war for 8 years, 7 years against England, and then a lot of people incredibly admire them afterwards, and during the war itself even, and admire their system of government. Certainly Hamilton does. He says it's the best system of government in the world. And lots of Americans, even up to 1775 and 76, are still saying that. But afterwards, a number are too. Adams, is always flirting with that. And especially the Jeffersonians are pointing to Adams all the time and saying he really is a monarchist. This is a guy, and Adams himself, and not to point too much at Adams, but just to say there's a lot of feeling around this. Adams, when they come up with what should we call a president? Now we've instituted a president, and he says something like, his highness or his mightiness. So it's this kind of notion of this is still somebody who is monarchical somehow around us. By the way, Adams gets called behind his back his rotundity in response to that, actually. It is an amazing kind of phenomenon that you have these people who still are loving England and respecting it and thinking this is the best possible way that government should go. Hamilton being chiefly among them. Yes, Don.
One thing that's often said in those who praise Hamilton, I think it's both in Churchill and Brookhiser, is that never in his career did he really seek to gain financially for any of his public service, and he really wasn't all that concerned with monetary wealth and monetary gain.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Well, he makes quite a bit of money when he becomes a lawyer, it's true, and he gets pretty comfortable, so I don't think he has to be too concerned with it. For one thing, it frees him up. It's kind of like when Benjamin Franklin becomes wealthy enough. And he marries into money too, exactly. I'm not completely convinced, to play the devil's advocate here a little bit too, I'm not completely convinced that, that he's completely above corruption. There is a lot of innuendos and discussion about what he is, what he's involved in. It was never proven, and so I'm only really kind of stirring the same pot of these kind of rumors that Jefferson and others would, or Madison. But I'm not completely convinced that he did not manipulate various things so that he also got some profit out of it. Still, I think by and he that they're probably right to say that Hamilton was, he probably was not involved in corruption, but I'm not completely there, I guess. Was there a question at the back?
If there's this interest in monarchy from several of these people, it seems as though to advocate that you almost have to have somebody in mind.
Yes.
And is there evidence of who they had in mind?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. It's going to be George Washington by that point, yeah. And it's the same thing about the Newburgh conspiracy. Everybody knows it's going to be George Washington. And I think, yes, whenever they're talking in this sense. And that would be, it would not only be the logical choice, but it would be the one who would be pretty acclaimed throughout, too. If you actually set up a monarchy, of course, we all love Washington, he won the war. And so by 1783, that's there. Although still part of the Newburgh conspiracy, and which I found amazing, is that Hamilton and some of the others are supporting Gates against Washington, even after Washington has become so incredibly popular. When Washington looks like he's not probably going to go along with this, Hamilton and others turn to General Gates and say, well, how about you? So, it's kind of mind-boggling, because how could you possibly think that you could supplant Washington in that situation and go against him? So there's something going on there that I just can't entirely comprehend. Yes, ma'am.
I just always admired him because he really pushed for that strong federal government. Thomas Jefferson, if it went his way, it would have been
Right.
15 separate states.
Yes.
So that was my main point of why I've always admired him, because it was, it was a compromise between the two.
Yes.
But that's why I appreciate him.
Yeah. And I tried to at least throw that in as one of the admirable points about it, because clearly, Most of us appreciate we have a strong federal government, and most of us know in the 21st century we need one. Or most of us believe, not all of us, but I agree. But it's that pushing for the strong federal government with the idea that the people who are going to be helped first, at least, are going to be the investor class. The people going to be helped first are the rich, is the thing that bothers me. Because you could press for a strong central government on other grounds, and you wouldn't have to always be putting the interest of that investor, merchant, industrial, big distiller class, up at the top of all of that, is what I find to be the objectionable part of that. But I much understand what you're saying. And
Also think one of the few founding fathers that supported the new countries becoming involved in manufacturing, whereas so many of the other ones wanted to be strictly agrarian.
yes, and the question up here is, wasn't he one of the ones who support industrialization and manufacturing, which is clearly going to be the future of the United States. And that's right, and that's another reason that he is celebrated, that he is anticipating where the United States is going to go. And that's the future. After you see what England has been doing, you clearly see, or some people clearly see, that this is the way the United States should be going. Lots of other people saying, no, they shouldn't be going that direction. But yes, another clear reason to be at least admiring of him. Yes?
I've read that Abigail Adams persuaded John Adams to invest in a lot of the bonds that were being sold by the soldiers after the war when they couldn't pay their bills, so they were taking whatever they could get for them. And that kind of speculation was behind much of the push for the strong central government and financing all the
Right.
And was Hamilton ever implicated in that speculation?
I don't, and it comes back to your point too. He's right. Is Hamilton really benefiting personally from the support of the funding of these bonds and paying off these bonds? And I don't know, and I don't know if either of my distinguished colleagues, Ken or Harry, know this answer, if Hamilton himself is doing that?
I don't think he was fingered by Charles Beard.
Yeah, right. When he would find the person who was. Charles Beard's an early 20th century American historian who sort of is the first one prominent historian to point out how many of the sort of famous founding fathers have a financial, pecuniary interest in having a strong central government that can levy federal taxes and then pay off the bondholders. So Charles Beard talks a lot about that and fingers a lot of people. I think you're right. I don't remember that. But
A number of his very closest friends did benefit very substantially from
Right.
this funding of the debt at face value,
Right.
with interest. Many of them went on to be speculators. They're kind of the Enron of Alexander Hamilton's life.
right.
Take the advantage of government regulation, speculate recklessly, and then collapse into bankruptcy. And these
Right.
are his very closest associates.
Right. Robert Morris being one, for example, yes.
My guess would be perhaps to his wife's family, the Schuyler's.
Yes.
They might have, I don't know if anybody's ever traced that.
Right.
To discover that.
Yes, sir.
How much weight would you put on George Washington's trust and belief and faith in Alexander Hamilton?
Oh yeah, I mean that's his. When you talk about self-made men in the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, they're clearly self-made men, but they have a lot of help along the way.
George Washington is known as the father of our country for some reason, but here Alexander Hamilton wasn't too much until he was really recognized by George Washington. George Washington depended on him.
Right.
Probably he was in on a lot of the financing of the war that enabled George Washington to get more troops and to keep the troops that he had. Because a lot of times George Washington would have to make personal arrangements with other people to get funds in so people would have money for the soldiers.
At the very end of the war, Shirley Hamilton is involved and closely associated with Robert Morris in helping raise more money for the troops and the officers at the last couple of years. But most of the time, Hamilton is his personal secretary, and then finally actually takes a field command at Yorktown. Asks Washington if he can take that final final push, and does lead the troops there, and apparently does very well. One story is that he had a horse shot out from under him, which, this kind of accusation about him being a coward doesn't ring too true then at that point. So clearly he seems to be, very reliable for Washington, seems to have an opinion about everything and an informed opinion about everything. It does help Washington a great deal with, lots of decision making.
Doesn't that go along with the way General George Washington ran the Army, though, and ran his generals? I mean, his opinions were always formulated by his officers after his officers, and he discussed them.
Well, it's always been one of the positive things that people have said about Washington as president, too. As what does he do, as opposed to some of our presidents, quite frankly, what does he do? He surrounds himself with really incredibly bright, competent people. When you put Hamilton and Jefferson in the same cabinet together, who are at odds already, you're picking out people who are really, really smart, but they're going to give you different perspectives on things.
Would you say that George Washington sort of appreciated this idea of Hamilton going out and getting in new ideas, whether the ideas are good or bad or indifferent, to collide with other people's ideas so they can develop a discussion and an attitude towards the plan of approaching the problem?
Well, Washington is surely informed by and convinced by Hamilton a lot. That's for certain. And Hamilton's views really carry the day with Washington once he's president in particular.
Could you say that, like, say, Hamilton's experience in government and experience in politics and everything originated under the reigns of George Washington?
Yeah. I mean, they both, yes, they both go together.
More than anything else,
right. If I could go back to this question too about, again, the funding of it, because it's also a key point and fits in with this kind of pushing for a federal government, a strong federal government, but one that's going to favor the wealthy, is the whole idea about funding the debt that comes out of the war. And especially the promises that have been made to troops, and common troops in particular, where they'll get a piece of paper promising them land in the West, or, bonds that they're supposed to cash in afterwards. And immediately after the war, the government's incapable of doing that, so a lot of soldiers are sitting around holding these bonds, and they start to sell them because they need the money. And they're selling them to speculators, to merchants, to big landholders, who are buying them at, half the price or 20% of the price or something like that. And Charles Beard, one of the early historians of the early 20th century, and a lot of people still give some credence to that today, says, well, one of the biggest impetuses for the federal government being established in the United States Constitution is because lots of this wealthy class want a strong government who can pay off this debt because they've got the bonds. If you bought the bonds for 20% of their value and you get paid off in full, you're going to make a hell of a lot of money. You're going to make a killing. So now, that's a pretty cynical view of human nature, too. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, we see, yes, exactly. And so it depends on, whose ox is gored and who's benefiting and all these kinds of things. But again, it seems to me it's Hamilton's view, and I guess they go to Ken's point here in some ways, too. It's a view, well, from my perspective, maybe not to put words in Ken's mouth, it's a class perspective of people that Hamilton is hanging out with, and they talk together and they share common values and they share common assumptions. And so you make these kinds of decisions, not necessarily because Alexander Hamilton himself is going to be the one who accrues the wealth, but because everybody this is exactly the kinds of things they're doing. And so this is the way in which people are talking and thinking. Bill, were you about to? Yeah.
This is kind of a broader question, but why do you think people like Washington supported the revolution? I mean, these elite kind of people, what do they have to gain from revolting against?
It is a broader question, you're right.
What's your take on that?
Yeah. Clearly, lots of people support the revolution and or oppose it for a whole variety of reasons. People like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, who are big slave owners in the South, I hesitate to generalize about, but these are people who, in a variety of ways, really do feel threatened their power position by the British, and they feel that their local power over Virginia is truly being threatened by British actions, and so I think in many ways that's a reason that they do enter into the American Revolution. But there's been just dozens and dozens of proposals put forward to try and explain this. So that surely doesn't capture and doesn't reflect at all the arguments that historians go through.
So their reasons for revolting would be quite a bit different from the common working people.
Yeah, I think so. I would certainly peg them that way, yes. Yeah. Yeah, Ken.
Let me turn our attention to the exhibition that's out in the hall,
Yeah.
which is a facsimile of a much larger exhibition at the New York City Historical Society,
Yeah.
Sponsored by Mr. Gilder and Lehman, and now by the NEH. In Hamilton's, we don't depend on Hamilton for the idea of developing American industry, right? That was a big thing already, even before the Declaration. We don't depend on Hamilton for stronger government. There were many people who knew we needed a stronger government, and even Jefferson made his peace with it in 1800. Why are they trying? Why is the National Endowment for the Humanities trying to convince us that without a man who wanted to use the army against the people, without a man who tried to stage a military coup, without a man who had contempt for the people, without a man who consistently favored the large capitalist instead of the small, without him, we wouldn't have survived? What are they selling us?
It could be because he never graduated from Harvard, right? Or did he? Or he never graduated from William and Mary?
I don't remember what his education, but what you're saying, he's not part of the group, right? He's not part of the in-group, essentially. He was Columbia. That's right, because his statue's in Columbia now, right?
Princeton was there. Madison went to Princeton, but I'm pretty sure didn't Hamilton go to Columbia?
He had to.
That's what I thought.
That's right, he had to because his statue's there.
Sorry to let you down, but
But he does fit in with the crowd then. And once he's accepted by Washington and endorsed, and then he's fitting in with that group. But of course there's splits in that group, I mean, Adams comes to just to test him and vice versa, clearly. Yes?
I guess the question comes to you then. We know what Kansas City is,
Yeah.
for sure. The thrust of this exhibit
Right.
is encapsulated really in the title. Of all the founding fathers,
Right.
the one person who did more than anyone else to make modern America,
Right.
and whose vision of modern America is reality today, is Alexander Hamilton.
Right.
Would you agree or disagree with that? Or to what extent would you agree with it, I guess?
Surely he helps set the foundation for the financial and banking system and the stability in that sense. Surely he does. On the other hand, if we're to look at the ethos of America in the early 21st century, democratic, multicultural, hopefully reaching across classes and things of that sort, that's not Alexander Hamilton. I mean, he's the one who is the least representative of that among the famous founding fathers. Even George Washington, who's quite conservative, is still more representative of our ethos and the culture and the values we share today than Alexander Hamilton is. So yes, it seems to me in the narrow confines, although Ken makes a good point, that he's not the only one who's talking about industry and manufacturing, and it's going to come down the line anyway. It may be encouraged more by government, but it's going to come down the line. So that's a long way of saying, no, I don't think he's the most important one. And in fact, in our cultural ways, he may be the least important of all these people, the least out of step with our heroes and heroines that we want to look back on today. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little detailed question, but on that whiskey tax.
Yeah.
What was the point of not taxing the large distillers as much as the small? I didn't get it.
He really does want to, and that's part of his support of industrialization, is what you do is you basically support people to, man, I'm having trouble talking there, is essentially to concentrate the wealth in the hands of a few large distillers who will then hire people who work for them. I mean, it's support of the growth of industry, essentially. So if you chase out the small producers, you're a small farmer who's producing, a little whiskey on the side. If we chase all of you out, and I'm the big distiller, I can then either hire you to come and work for me, but I'm going to make a lot more money, and I'm going to be able to expand my operation, essentially. So it's a way to end competition, too, with small distillers.
So he would have completely approved of today's economic arrangement with multinational corporations.
He would not have had problems with the increasing inequality in wealth that we've seen so dramatically over the last 15 years throughout the world, especially in the United States. Would not have bothered Hamilton at all. And in fact, I think he would have said, ultimately, this is a pretty good thing. It's those elites who should be ruling anyway. The large landholders, well, at that time, not now, of course, but it's the equivalent of the large landholders and the merchants, those kind of people, controlling most of the wealth, most of the power. They're going to make the best decisions, is what he would say. And the most dispassionate positions are decisions, is what he would also say. Because, the arguments of most of these founding fathers that we know from the Constitutional Convention in particular is very close to Hamilton, oddly. I mean, it is an arrogance that it's only their class who's capable of ruling, and that they have been separated from self-interest because they become so wealthy. If you're wealthy enough, you don't have to vote your self-interest, is what they would say. And Hamilton's not too far from that. He just pushes it further over to the political right. But essentially, they're pretty much all in agreement at the convention. All pretty much saying that. None of them want democracy at the convention. If you look at their statements when they're going to the convention, virtually all of them fear democracy. John Adams says, if you let democracy occur, the Democrats, the people, are going to raise up and kill you and take away your property. So, Hamilton's far from being the only one who is thinking in these terms among the famous founding fathers. But again, I see him as more questionable because he's further over to the right than they are. Let's go back to the king.
Don't you think that if there wasn't Alexander Hamilton, the others may have been persuaded by Thomas Jefferson more, or no? It's been a long time, so I can't really
Sure.
remember.
No, of course,
but
of course.
I just remember
Right.
just always thinking, wow, that man's brilliant.
And he was brilliant. There is no question, but lots of brilliant people have been wrong.
Right, I mean, he definitely is way, I don't believe in all his
Yeah, of course. Right.
but he is very important. And
Right.
I just remember that it seemed like everybody was listening to Thomas Jefferson.
Right. He clearly is a mover and a shaker to, get the convention going. There is no doubt about that. But there are other factors going on. There are other things that are really worrying the upper class. Shays' Rebellion, 1780s, for example, right before the Constitutional Convention, worries the hell out of George Washington and other people too. Now, Hamilton's there to kind of focus the moment and push them to the convention. But I'm guessing, and in the spirit of this arguing for a class position, that even if there wasn't an Alexander Hamilton, you still have enough fear going around the society at the upper reaches that we've got to do something about. One of the things is being able to control people, like the later whiskey rebels. Now we've got Shays' Rebellion here. We've got to control those people, and also there is a genuine interest in what is America going to become too, and we need a stronger central government for that. Again, a long-winded way of saying, I think it would have happened without Hamilton because, there's a certain agreement among a certain class who can pull that off and use that power to institute the government. And, I think most of us today think, the U.S. government's a good thing. Again, the Montana militia is still around. Who doesn't? So it depends on where you are about this. But most of us in the room probably think that, it's good to have a U.S. government. How it came about and, how it was created, though, and what the legacy of that is something important to think about. Yes?
I'm interested in the psychology of this guy that seems so conflicted. I mean, he doesn't appear conflicted, but he's not a member of the elite, but he's way pushing the elite.
Right.
And he's anti-slavery, but he's also anti-democratic.
Right.
Are there any good authors to read on the psychology of Alexander Hamilton?
Well, the two two most recent ones, I don't think are really looking at him in that sense. And I'm trying to think of a biographer who does.
Well, like a lot of historical figures, I don't think anybody's put Hamilton on the couch yet.
Oh, yes, that's probably
Hamilton
right.
Burr,
Right, right,
whatever order it's in on his title.
right, right. No, I think that's right.
He's a former head of the Park Service under Reagan, by the way, so his conservative credentials are impeccable.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a fascinating book because he introduces it. Oxford University Press, right? Well reviewed in the New York Times. Retired, started writing, written a couple of them. They've all gotten good reviews. He starts the book out by saying, well, when I retired, I thought I'd study the Founding Fathers. And having been a second-level politician, and surrounded by first-level politicians, I expected to find in the literature on the Founding Fathers all the nerves and paranoia and conspiracy and aggression that you find in top-level politicians anywhere. It's just the nature of top-level politics. And I read book after book by historian after historian, and I never found it. And I was amazed. They must be themselves golden tablets sent down from the hill by God. Until he said, I read their letters, and there it all was. These were the politicians I'd worked with all my life. This is how politics is. It does that to people. And so he wrote his book. So I don't know if he's a psychoanalyst. He's certainly not that. But you'll get a much better look at the human side and the contradictions of all three men, Hamilton, Burr, and Jefferson, from Roger Kennedy's book.
Right, right. No, I think you're right, yeah. And it surely is the case that, and one of the reasons I put some of the quotes up here, and I know you had a session about how the president thought about Hamilton, so I'm sure you got some similar quotes, but it is fairly startling when you see how nasty these famous founding fathers who we've glorified are to each other. What they think, calling each other hypocrites, bastards. It's just like, it's a very common kind of thing to be doing. It's like, that, and the campaign of 1800 is as nasty as anything we've had. We think that, the election of 2000 was kind of a nasty one, and maybe the coming election is going to be a nasty one, but we're not going to surpass the one of 1800 very much. Very nasty. Everybody wheeling and dealing, Burr wheeling and dealing, Hamilton wheeling and dealing, Jefferson, everybody is really playing nasty games. So stealing elections, slanting elections, all this kind of stuff has a long tradition in American history. Whether it makes us feel better or not, I'm not sure, but it's not anything new in our own times. If that's the case,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And once again, happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you.